He's known as a strict disciplinarian, in many ways an old-styler. But that same steel was setting him on a collision course with Mr. Doherty.
Sergeant Tully, I would regard as an excellent policeman. He's a man who believes that it's the same law for everybody. He's a hard-working man, and he believes in enforcing the law without fear or favour. That's my impression of Sergeant Tully.
The 3 cases examined so far are part of what was recognised as a persistent pattern of intervention in Garda activities in his home county of Roscommon by Sean Doherty when Junior Minister for Justice. They clearly establish a willingness to use his position of influence to a point unprecedented in the eyes of many Gardaí. In certain cases, the ordinary rule of law appears to have been undermined. In at least 4 different Roscommon towns, Gardaí have been taunted by civilians in the streets, suggesting that prosecutions pending wouldn't proceed, or that the Garda in question was likely to be transferred. But there are other incidents in Roscommon which give cause for disquiet. Next, we examine several cases of abandoned prosecutions. On Saturday, February 6th, 1982, at about 2:20 in the morning, Keeney's pub was raided again. A prosecution was set in motion. The pub was raided in February of this year during the general election. The election brought a change of government. It also seemed to bring a change of heart with regard to the prosecution. After the change of administration, the files were recalled by a senior officer who cancelled his earlier direction to prosecute. On the Keeney's file, he wrote, quote, "It is understood a party political meeting was held on the premises on the night in question," unquote. Our inquiries have produced no evidence of a party political meeting on the night in question. A second reason was given, quote, "It is policy not to prosecute during election time." The Garda Press Office told us there is no such policy. Sergeant Tully complained to the officer concerned that this was unfair administration of the law, but the case was cancelled.
Well, there have been allegations that there was a bit of soft peddling in regard to prosecutions.
In what kind of instances?
Some fairly serious, others not so serious.
The case of O'Dowd's Butchers, Patrick Street Boyle, is also unusual. In December 1980, it was robbed of £360 worth of meat. On March the 6th, 1981, the guards got a signed confession of guilt from a local youth. This statement was detailed and precise. The break-in occurred at the rear of O'Dowd's in this laneway. The statement implicated 2 others, said locally to have political connections. The case came to court on April 1st, 1981. There was considerable surprise when a senior Garda officer said he was offering no evidence. The case was automatically dismissed. Last month, in another development, a Roscommon doctor publicly stated his concern that local Gardaí were being pressurised not to enforce drunken driving laws in the county.
It's not being done, and my main concern is that, if at all possible, road traffic accidents be prevented and alcoholism be nipped in the bud if possible.
Do you believe there actually are cases where prosecutions didn't materialise but where the evidence would warrant a prosecution?
Well, I've taken blood from 2 individuals over the last 2 to 3 years anyway, in whom, well, my clinical impression was that they would have been above the limit. And as far as I'm aware, they never subsequently came to prosecution. The only way it can be explained is that there must be some way the cases, or the guards, are being interfered with, really. I think that's the only explanation I have.
Is there much speculation to that effect locally?
Well, there's a lot of speculation to that effect locally.
And what would the source of the interference be?
Well, I prefer not to say anything on that, but I mean, it must come above the local level, presumably. politicians, obviously, were the likely.
All politicians?
Well, I haven't heard of it in relation to all politicians. I've only heard of it in relation to one politician.
Another cause for concern from our research relates to a little-known power vested in the Minister for Justice. Under the Criminal Justice Act 1951, a convicted person may petition the Minister for Justice for clemency. The Act confers almost absolute authority on the Minister, with few exceptions. Pleas for clemency are addressed to the Minister here at the Department of Justice. Our evidence suggests there's an extraordinary number of successful petitions coming from Roscommon. One guard in Boyle told us every fine in the Boyle area is petitioned. He said it's always reduced. If this is true, it suggests the power of clemency is being considerably overused by Mr. Doherty. The pointers are there to be picked up in Roscommon. In a recent case involving a local Fianna Fáil activist, a fine of £80 was petitioned. The fine was imposed for offences related to a lorry. Clemency was exercised. The fine was reduced to nil. We've been told of other instances in Roscommon of fines being reduced on petition from £150 to £80 and £100 down to £30. Such acts of clemency are recorded in the Department of Justice, but they are not a matter of public record. The public has no right to know who gets what degree of clemency, or even to know how many petitions are successful. Under their regulations, none of the guards we have referred to are allowed to speak to the media. Anonymously, others have spoken their minds, and the following comments are representative of what we heard in Roscommon. Of Sean Doherty, a Roscommon guard told us, Doherty is power around here. No one in the guards will say anything to offend him. They're just afraid. And another guard, maybe all ministers for justice were as bad, but if they were, I don't know how people stuck it. Sergeant Tully has told colleagues, interference from the Minister for Justice's office takes place in the Boyle district in most cases detected by the Gardaí. Another guard in the county states, I must have taken at least 9 calls from the Minister's private office. The line would be, the Minister is most anxious that you do not press charges in such and such a DPP case. One senior officer said to us, you get a phone call from the Minister's office, you know he's interested. He wouldn't ring if he wasn't. It's the loneliest place in the world when you say no. And a Roscommon guard said, the problem with saying no is that you just know they'll go to someone else, an officer who will say yes, so it will be done anyway in the end. Since becoming a cabinet minister, Mr. Doherty appears to have become more discreet, but no less active in his intervention. Throughout the county, we've been told of phone calls from the Minister's office and even visits to Garda stations from some of his staff. Many guards we've spoken to are worried about the regularity and extent of such interventions in Roscommon. Indeed, a few guards have said that in some instances where associates of Mr. Doherty are involved, they've learned simply to keep their distance. The final case examined in the Roscommon file is the long drawn-out affair of the attempted transfer of Sergeant Tom Tully. On May 30th this year, Sergeant Tully and others raided Keeney's pub again, after hours. In July, 13 days after serving the summons, Sergeant Tully learned he was to be transferred to Ballyconnell, County Cavan. He had not applied for a transfer. It came as a bombshell. Tully's superior, Superintendent Bernard King of Boyle, was also taken completely by surprise when 2 days later he was told by his station clerk of the imminent transfer. Many features of the transfer procedure were irregular. For example, Tully was first informed of his proposed move by phone from Roscommon Station while on holidays. Further, at Boyle Station, Superintendent King was dismayed. He had no grounds for complaint against his senior sergeant. And on the streets of Boyle, there had been taunts, even before the proposed transfer, that Tully would go. Sergeant Tully was given no reason for the proposed transfer. His appeal against this to the Garda Commissioner was turned down flat, even though it was supported by his superintendent in Boyle and his chief superintendent in Roscommon. And it was on the roadside in Tulsk that Superintendent King learned from the chief superintendent that Tully's appeal was rejected. Meanwhile, As Sergeant Tully's Garda superiors called this Christmas at a special news conference for a clampdown on drunken driving, the contrast between this and Tully's experience in Boyle seems especially sharp. To what extent do you yourself fully stand behind officers of the law in enforcing licensing laws and drunk driving laws?
I don't appreciate what you mean by what extent do I stand behind. I stand behind the Garda in enforcing the law rigidly and relentlessly in every possible area.
Well, I'm thinking specifically of a case which has been widely in the news recently of a Sergeant Tully in Boyle. And it appears from the details of that case he's a man who rigidly enforces the law with regard to drink, licensing hours and so on without fear or favour. And he was the subject of a transfer order which caused considerable surprise to the local community in Boyle.
I would like you would check on your facts. I happen to know the Boyle area pretty well, and I ordered the transfer in my capacity as in control of the overall management of the force. Sergeant Tully is a particularly good, effective worker, and I transferred him to an area that was busier than Boyle was in the hope that his energy and industry would be used in an area where it was even more needed than it was in Boyle.
When word went out that the sergeant was being changed, a comment I heard, which I would regard as typical, was that it comes to a queer pass when that happens to a man who does his duty.
And why do you think it was happening to that man?
Well, I can only say what the general impression is. The general impression is that pressure was being put, or maybe pressure is too strong a word, but there was an attempt to persuade the sergeant to keep cases out of court, and that he consistently resisted that pressure, and in doing so that he was preventing some of the constituents from getting a service that they had come to expect. That would be a common feeling enough.
I knew that the sergeant was here for some years and was doing his duty, and that he was regarded as a good policeman. And I was rather surprised when I heard that he was being transferred, particularly when the insinuation was that he was being transferred for doing his duty. And in fact, I referred to this in my paper.
In its edition of October 8th, the Roscommon Herald had a long editorial on the Gardaí. In the course of this, it was stated, there have been too many instances of political interference with the Gardaí in the course of carrying out their duties. It is intolerable that this situation exists, and the exercise of political pressure on any member undermines the whole concept of an independent and impartial police force. It must also be made clear to all and sundry that a guard's resistance to political pressure will not be rewarded by a transfer to a bog station.
I always felt that it was wrong that this kind of thing should happen. And I felt that it would continue to happen until the guards decided themselves that it wouldn't be allowed to happen, until they stood up to it.
Sergeant Tully's personal response to the attempted transfer has been expressed to colleagues. I have no intention of apologising to anyone for doing my duty, either now or in the future. Offered no reason for the transfer and rejected by the Commissioner, Tully had only one course open. He turned to his professional association to champion his cause. For Tully, the transfer order had come out of the blue, unexpected and unwanted. The Association of Garda Sergeants and Inspectors could see what was coming, what the implications of the Tully transfer were. They were prepared to appeal the case before a review board. But meanwhile, there was another strange turn in events. We have learned that while the appeal was pending, the Minister for Justice told one senior officer that Tully can pack his bags, whatever about the appeal. This clearly established his personal interest in the transfer. The association brought Sergeant Tully's case to the Garda Review Board, and if there was a reasonable explanation for the transfer, this was the place to offer it.
People don't know what the reason of his transfer was, and an opportunity came to give that reason when the case was appealed before the review body. And that explanation wasn't given. There was no explanation given of why Sergeant Tully was changed. Now, if there was an explanation, why not give it? And in the absence of a suitable explanation, there seems to be no other explanation open to people to take than that he was moved because he didn't do what he was asked to do in keeping cases out of court.
Well, who would have been asking him to keep these cases out of court?
Well, I suppose the impression is that it was political interference. That is the impression.
By?
You know, the minister's name is mentioned.
The Garda Review Board, which heard Sergeant Tully's case, has itself brought a further series of extraordinary developments. It's the highest level of conciliation in such disputes. A three-man body, it comprises a representative of the sergeants and inspectors, a representative of the Department of Justice, and a representative of the Garda Commissioner. The sergeants and inspectors voted against the transfer. The Department of Justice voted against the transfer. Perhaps most unusual of all, the Commissioner's representative, who happened to be Deputy Commissioner Larry Wren, voted against the transfer. The proposed move of Sergeant Tully was dismissed unanimously. The only question hanging after this summary and unprecedented decision by the board was, who does favour Sergeant Tully's transfer? Within hours of the Review Board's decision, the Minister telephoned both his own department's representative and the Deputy Commissioner. Mr. Doherty was annoyed with the outcome. On the telephone, he complained vigorously to both men. Not content with this, the Minister summoned Deputy Commissioner Wren, one of the most distinguished officers in the force, to his office next morning. The Deputy Commissioner is seen here on the left. The Minister complained of the failure to transfer Tully. Also carpeted, again, that morning was the department's representative. These actions of Sean Doherty behind the scenes were in total contradiction to his public stance, which has been that Tom Tully's transfer is a matter for the Commissioner. His personal role in the transfer was conclusively demonstrated by his actions. However, the story does not fully end there. A mysterious petition has since appeared within the Boyle station, outside normal representative channels and critical of Sergeant Tully. A number of guards are believed to have signed the document. This petition has been seen as a final desperate attempt by someone somewhere to dislodge Tully. But Tully's record makes a mockery of that petition. That record is 27 years of service without a single complaint filed against him by a senior officer.
And as far as we were concerned, you know, the whole question, the fact that it was the first case that we had won at the review body, and whereas we do not know what went on at the review body itself because the details of that are confidential, we do understand that it was a unanimous decision of the review body not to transfer.
Well, were reasons offered at that review body as to why the transfer was to take place?
To our knowledge, no, and this is another reason for it. None whatever.
And what reasons are believed to be responsible for the transfer?
Well, I'm quite sure that people who know more about it know why. You know, Sergeant Tully was a very diligent policeman, and he did his duty without fear, favour, malice or ill will, as his oath prescribes that he should do.
But the Commissioner is responsible, ultimately, for these things in law, and the Commissioner is the one who wanted to transfer him.
That's the situation, yes. It was the Commission who made the final decision to transfer, yes.
You say he's a man who is applying the law without fear or favour. Why would the Commissioner want to do that?
Well, he must have had his reasons. I don't know what was in the Commissioner's mind at the time or why he felt that he had to transfer him, but he must have had his reasons. And
do you believe there were pressures on the Commissioner or others with regard to the transfer?
As I said at the outset, the transfer should never have taken place. It didn't take place, but even the whole question of the transfer should never have arisen. And for that reason, there must have been something. Must have been something there.
Something where?
Behind the Commissioner's decision, other than what was apparent to us.
May there have been political interference?
Certainly.
Has that been speculated on?
Oh, certainly, of course it has. In that particular area it has, yes. Within
your own association?
Yes.
What's your own belief?
Well, what I believe that there was there was certain influence used in relation to it, yes.
From the Department of Justice?
Well, I wouldn't like to say on this particular programme where it came from, but it certainly, there was.
But you believe there was interference?
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Well, could I ask you about the petition which I understand has circulated since the successful appeal against the transfer by Sergeant Tully? Colleagues of his have petitioned, apparently, that he be transferred.
Well, once a man has been vindicated in the eyes of an independent review body, we are satisfied that there was no reason whatever for it. A whole lot of things can enter into it at this particular time, and that's what we are satisfied has happened in this particular case, and that's sad.
Do you think, is this a peculiar or odd procedure?
It's totally unusual, and we have never had it before.
You've never had it before?
No. Not in so long as I've been in the association, we haven't had it before.
And how would you explain it?
I believe that it was motivated. I'll say no more than that.
You believe it was motivated? Externally from the station itself?
I'll say no more than that,
The whole Tully affair has come at a time when Derek Nally's association has been determined to stamp out completely interference with the Guards.
We all know the old cliche, the old story that's told about, in relation to the Guards, which I always regard as very denigrating of the Guard finding the politician or the minister, whatever it was in the pub, and saying to him, will you take a transfer or a pint? Now, as far as my association are concerned, that day is over. We will not accept any interference, undue interference in the profession of the Guard. We're professionals doing a professional job, having taken an oath to do so. And it's wrong that there should be any interference, and we have a mandate and a duty to protect and promote the interests of our members, and that's what we intend to do, irrespective of who attempts to interfere. Who?
Why do the Guards give in to this kind of pressure?
Well, there are many reasons. I believe that the checks and balances that exist aren't strong enough at all. And then there's the whole question of how people advance through the force. It's nice to be well thought of by people who are senior to you.
A key factor in political interference with the Guards is the promotion system. For someone who wants to get ahead, the lower ranks up to inspector are all non-political appointments. But from superintendents upwards, it's the Minister for Justice who makes the appointments, all the way up to commissioners. So while in theory the force is independent, it's obvious the political boss has influence right down through the ranks. One guard, speaking of a senior officer who had agreed to square a case, told us, this is the way some inspectors get to be superintendents, the way superintendents get even higher. It's one way to get promotion. Yet again, the whole area of Garda promotions has been thrust into the public arena this week by Mr. Doherty's last-minute decision to create an entirely new post at the level of Deputy Commissioner, in the promotion of Assistant Commissioner Joe Ainsworth. The step of creating an additional senior post in the last days of a government is unprecedented. But even among much lower ranks, the sergeants and inspectors now see the promotional system in the Garda Síochána as a deadly virus infecting officers' sense of independence. You believe that the actual promotion procedure is probably one of the reasons why the interference is successful?
I believe that until such time as we have a police authority in this country which will remove the Garda Síochána from the direct influence of the government of the day, for the day-to-day running of the Garda Síochána, that this can, and that will appoint the senior officers in the force, from Assistant Commissioner upwards.
So for you, a police authority is the answer?
For us, a police authority is a must. Not alone the answer, it's a must, in very, very speedily as well. Because unless we are to, if the people are to retain the confidence in the Garda Síochána, they must see that we are able and capable of doing our duty without fear, favour, malice or ill will. And I would also say that, in my view, that there should be certain sanctions introduced for police officers who allow themselves to be used, for whatever reason they allow themselves to be used in this particular regard.
Some cause for concern there in that report from Pat Cox. During the election campaign, both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael committed themselves to a judicial inquiry into allegations of political interference. So it's likely, therefore, that whichever government comes to power on Tuesday next, the relationship between the Garda Síochána and their political masters will come under close scrutiny and in sworn proceedings. In part two, the crisis in the ESB. Join us then.